We are talking today, as I said, about consumption, and the assumption that we've made is that all of our panelists have got some kind of interest in this idea about people consuming either less or consuming differently or both, all in the name of tackling the climate crisis. So I'm going to come to each one of you in turn and ask you to do a quick 2-minute elevator pitch on what's your experience in tackling the climate impacts of consumption and what contribution do you think you're going to be making to the conversation today. So I'm going to go around my screen. Ollie, let's start with you.
Super, thank you, Ali, and thank you for having me. First thing I would say is that I am an anthropologist, and as anyone knows, that means I'm fascinated by culture, but particularly the culture of ethics and how and why people make decisions about right and wrong and how people perceive the future differently. And for me, consumption is about both of those things. It's about decisions about right and wrong, how people perceive those things differently around the world, and also how we think about the types of future that we want to make for ourselves and we want to make for other people. So that means I work in the space of sustainable consumption more broadly, consulting with businesses, organizations, and a lot of the time consulting with colleagues, really. How can they think about what they do differently, whether or not that's designing products and services, thinking of marketing and communication campaigns, or training and upskilling how we think about design and creativity within organizations. And that's my current role and remit. So there's definitely a fascination and somewhat of a lifelong obsession in there somewhere.
Nice. It's always nice to think about the ethical elements of what we do. We get very fixated on carbon sometimes in my world, and thinking about it in a more rounded way is really well worth the effort. I'm going to move on to Laura.
Hello, lovely to be here. Yeah, my contribution is around, how we can go beyond just talking about individual behaviors. My academic background in philosophy, so also kind of thinking about ethics a bit, but my work is in creativity and imagination and thinking about the lives that we want to be living. So I work as head of sustainability and planet services at Think House, which is a youth marketing company in Ireland, with both global and local clients. And we're a B corporation, and we're a government sustainable development goal champion, really focused on SDG 12, responsible consumption and production. And I work on impact-driven campaigns with clients, and also Think House funded projects around, I guess, those values that we try to live as a business. And over the past 9 years, my background has really been in strategy and kind of looking at how we direct our storytelling, with insights that are from the next generation of young people who help us to see around corners and really challenge outdated ideas. And then about 6 years ago, I spent time really exploring the relationship between marketing and climate breakdown with a group of others in the industry, and came away with this deep understanding of how my job on a day-to-day basis in the traditional sense was really part of the problem. And so I guess instead of leaving the industry, I decided to focus on how we channel our skills in the direction that we want to go into the future. And so that led me to work with a group called Purpose Disruptors, which is a not-for-profit founded in the UK, really all revolving around the question, what if the advertising industry transformed to be in service of a thriving future? And so I'm currently working on a couple of projects with them that I'll speak a little bit about later, but really looking forward to the conversation, and thank you for having me.
Fantastic. Thanks, Laura. I'm really interested in that idea of the creative industry looking for the right briefs and defining its own brief. So yeah, looking forward to hearing a bit more about that. Dan, you're next.
Nice to see you all. I'm so glad there's so many philosophers on the panel. I originally did want to study philosophy and genuinely ticked psychology at my A-levels by accident, and then about 6 weeks realized I was in the wrong class. But now I lead the psychology behavioral science team at Ogilvy, one of the world's largest advertisers. We like to say the world's most awarded advertisers, a marketing group, and been bringing behavioral science here for the past 12 years, really thinking, seeing what would happen if we had a team of cognitive psychologists, social psychologists, behavioral scientists, if we plugged them into the heart of a marketing agency, what would happen? And kind of 12 years later, we've got thousands of projects, thousands of results of when you plug it into advertising, into PR, into changing customer experiences, and really thinking about one of my favorite things to think about is how you align the incentives correctly. We work for people, planet, profit. And so when you can combine those things, how do you make sustainability even more sustainable, is one of my favorite things to think about. And the biggest thing, I think, that when you think like a behavioral scientist, you recognize the huge say-do gap. You recognize that sustainability from a customer decision making is often a reinforcer, not a driver. It's a nice pat on the back, but it's not necessarily the reasons why people do things. And so I always say kind of the roles that we have is to figure out how to get a thought out of a customer's head and how to get a thought into a customer's head at its most simple. So yeah, looking forward to talking about how we do that.
Brilliant. Yeah, the say-do gap is just that perennial bugbear of all of us, I'm sure. Particularly those of us who do research and campaign delivery alongside each other. Frustrating. Last but not least, Poppy.
Thank you, Ali. Thanks for having me, and lovely to be here. It's probably now is the time to say I also studied philosophy. And when I studied it, my parents were like, "What on earth are you going to do with a philosophy degree?" And here we all are on this website about sustainability. But my background, I mean, I'm a media junkie and marketing junkie at heart. I've spent 15 years working in what I'd call big media, so the likes of National Geographic and Fox, and it's the good side of Fox, not the bad side, just a caveat. And I pivoted a few years ago and started really considering the idea that stories have this power. They can move, they can inspire, they can engage. But what if we could connect that kind of, I mean, it comes to that say-do gap, but what if we connect the stories to actual action, and use stories and that aha moment to give people a bit of a kick up the bum into action. And I've just been obsessed with the idea that media could be a force for good if we use it and harness it in the right way. So that led me to Waterbear, which I co-founded with a bunch of other great people. Waterbear, for anyone that doesn't know, is an impact media network or an impact media group. Essentially very similar to a streaming platform, but using real good stories to create real change. So we connect stories to campaigns. We have 150 NGO partners. We work with incredible organizations who are genuinely on their mission to do good and to change. And we create compelling stories and connect them to campaigns on the ground. It's as simple as that, while building a community that can drive towards collective action. So I'm really coming at it from the storytelling perspective today, and how we can harness comms to do the right thing.
Lovely. And any of us who have children will recognise the power of storytelling to get behaviours shifting in the direction that we want them to. So thank you for that, Poppy. I ought to just say before I carry on, I also have a degree in philosophy. So we've almost got a complete thing going on here. Great. I'm going to dive first into the area which I think the place where all of this starts, which is with human beings, with people, with a sort of people centricity, if you like. All of us think about audiences all the time. So I wanted to ask, I think I'll start with Ollie, if that's all right, as the anthropologist and researcher in the room, about like, when we're talking to people, when we're talking to audiences, is there a way of segmenting them that works for talking about this kind of consumption? Are there audiences for whom it works better, for whom it works less well? What's a good way of understanding those audiences? Is it age? Is it affluence? Is it what's your experience of looking at audiences and how to segment them?
So in the last 3 or 4 years, I've been thinking about this question a lot, as my wife would tell you if she was here, probably too much, in fact. And we started by asking the last thing you said, Ali, which is, to what extent do demographics and more psychological perspectives or instances or bias influence the likelihood of someone behaving or enacting sustainably? So therefore, in demographics and in psychological component parts that we might come to understand, does that hold the key to engaging more people more often towards sustainable ends? And my instinct, unsurprisingly, was we're missing something if that's where we start from, because we're missing the importance of culture. And most importantly, we're missing understanding how and why people's relationships with sustainability around the world depend upon culture. And most specifically, an element of culture, which is worldviews. And worldviews, for anyone who might be interested, encompasses 2 really important dynamics. The first is an ontological dynamic about how people think about reality. Like, what's their relationship with what the sky is? Why is the sky there? Who put it there, for example? Number 1. Number 2, a more epistemological question. Who do we listen to? Where does knowledge come from? What do we believe to be truthful? And for me, it was a combination, or my instinct was, it's a combination of those two things that really depend and change people's relationships with sustainability. And I thought, what if we segmented people or organized our perspective about people according to these worldviews? So we explored it ethnographically in 8 markets around the world and got a sense that we were onto something good. And then we doubled it down into these different parameters of worldviews, such as control. How much or to what extent do people feel like they're in control of their lives? Things like responsibility. Who do people believe is responsible for change, individuals or a collective? You know, are people optimistic or are they pessimistic? These different parameters of people's worldviews, we then tested and evaluated globally to see, do these influence people's relationships with sustainability? And the short answer is yes, and they do more powerfully and more succinctly than demographics do. So there are gendered variations, income variations, economic, educational level variations, but when you separate people who are engaged and taking action from people who are not, and you look at worldviews, it's really clear. It's like a mirror image. People who are engaged are far more optimistic, for example, than people who are not. And there are other characteristics like this. So we built out this data and we built out this idea to create 6 archetypes of people's relationships with sustainability and people's relationships with sustainable living. And we've been asking people in our own organization, but also in conversations with clients for approximately a year or maybe 18 months, what if we started with this level of understanding first and used it to help us design our messaging strategies to buy and target through media? And probably most importantly, to work out, how do we meet people where they are now with how they think about the world, how they think about their role in it, how they think about the likelihood that things are going to get better or they're going to get worse. And we designed what we're trying to do around them. We built products and services around them, and we built marketing and communications around them. And that's kind of in the middle of where we're at right now. And I don't have that kind of golden nugget of, and it works because look at this statistic. What we're doing is really experimenting with it, and we're playing with it at the moment. But the early indications are that if you combine it with what organizations already know to be true about the propensity for people to buy certain things or to behave in certain ways or to watch certain programs or not, it becomes a really powerful kind of marriage of what you might think of as sort of traditional demographic style or even psychographic style segmentation and this more culturally specific worldview oriented segmentation. So that's really some of the work that we're playing with at the moment.
Yeah, and I've seen some of that work, Ollie, and it's really, really fascinating stuff, and is incredibly useful to think it through in order to be like really properly person-centric in your approach to communicating. Laura, does that ring true? Because you've done some work on looking at ways of getting messages to land with different people, haven't you? And you're particularly focused on young people. How does that resonate for you, that cultural lens?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it would definitely look at things through the lens of culture as well, and all about, like, where are people? I mean, I think to come at it maybe through the perspective of the work I do with purpose disruptors, we look at it through the lens of, maybe more systemically from an industry perspective, actually, like, who are the big players in terms of influencing culture, and how do we actually engage those audiences then in this conversation in a new way? So it's not just the lens of the individual, but actually who's influencing culture, and how do we either as with our clients influence culture in a positive way, or through work with purpose disruptors actually look at the culture shapers and look at how we engage them in the things that really excite them. So, for example, one of the pillars of our work in purpose disruptors is creativity, and this Good Life project that I mentioned, Good Life 2030, is all around inviting the industry to imagine alternative visions of the future and work with people in the industry who are strategists, who are creators, who are working on client briefs day to day to help redefine the role of advertising and how we can move towards its transformation. Because, if it continues as is, nothing will change in terms of, that worldview, I guess, in terms of like how people live their lives and see consumption as just a normal part of it, versus actually really changing that paradigm in terms of the stories we tell. So the Good Life really came from the sense that, marketing and advertising and culture right now is telling a story that more is a good life. So more stuff or more wealth. And how do we actually tell new stories that don't perpetuate that narrative? which I think is really exciting. It's not just saying, it is up to each individual to kind of change their worldviews or to impact worldviews, but actually how do we as a collective industry look at the stories and the narratives that have been perpetuated and figure out, why is that and how do we challenge that thinking ourselves? And I think that that is really exciting and a way to actually future-proof our businesses at the same time.
Does that require creatives to challenge clients in quite a difficult way sometimes? What's your experience of that?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the other pillar of our work is education, and it's all around changing the brief. So actually looking at how we work with clients and kind of providing responses to a fictional future brief rather than just the brief that lands at your table. So at the moment sometimes it is quite playful in that, what if, kind of saying, what if we actually shifted our thinking in another way? But also, rooting it in science and the behaviors and the lives that we want to be living. But I guess those conversations sometimes are quite, a lot of people, going through these kind of technical or educational pieces, like go through a personal shift as well. So a lot of it is managing the emotions that come with actually changing these stories, because at the end of the day, as I said in my introduction, you change your perspective on where you sit in this broader story at the same time. And that is an emotional roller coaster, kind of turning around and having to say, oh, I've actually been part of the problem. And so that in itself is a huge learning curve, and not to be underestimated when you start to kind of challenge people's, day-to-day lives. A lot of people do get defensive or do get resistance. So how do you create that environment that is inviting and that is saying, actually, like, what if this is just an experiment that we do? And then the things that come out of those experiments, start to seep into people's, personal values that then actually come up in conversation in day-to-day lives. So like that kind of theory of change really is like, if we can change the people, we can change the outputs and then as a result change society. So it all really starts with those human conversations and how we feel about all of these problems that we're currently facing and our part to play in it.
Yeah, lovely. That's a really nice perspective. Poppy, you tell stories through Water Bear. Have you seen, Laura was just talking about storytelling. Have you seen some particularly good stories that have done it particularly well in your work as you've been sharing them?
Yeah, I think it's interesting talking about changing the brief, because that's what, at Water Bear we work with NGO partners, but also brands, right? And you get different kinds of brands who come to us and say, how can we tell stories to sell a shoe? And we're like, no, hang on, that's kind of not what we do here. How can we tell stories to drive impact, to drive action, to drive tangible real world change? Yep, sign us up, we'll partner with you and we'll create a documentary and distribute that to the audience, right? So those are the conversations around how can you start encouraging people to reshape or reframe the brief and start thinking about the marketing funnel as a very different funnel to how it's traditionally been. Speaking as a marketeer, 5 or 6 years ago, I'd have been on that side thinking, I need to hit my performance marketing metrics, I need to hit my sales targets, I need to report to the board on this. But actually it's time to reframe. And we're seeing a lot of organizations want to reframe. There's a lot of organizations and brands that have started their journey and are looking at how they can put their brand weight behind real, authentic, purpose-driven storytelling, which is fantastic. We work with some amazing partners like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who I'll touch on a little bit later on, but their focus is on how can we mainstream the idea of circularity and what is the kind of storytelling that needs to be created to tap into that mainstream audience to educate people on circularity. And we've just produced a lovely 3-part series that you can go and check out on the platform called Other Ways of Living. The platform's free to download, everyone, so thousands of docs at your fingertips for free. But that series the brief was how could we make circularity sexy? Not an easy brief, and why we're here today, I'm sure. But I think we're super proud of the content we've produced with those guys, because it's tapping into culture. So coming back to what Ollie was just talking about, tapping into the idea of what are things that everyday humans can recognize and get behind. Because I think the other thing is it's such a broad concept, circularity, and so is the climate crisis, and everything is so big and intangible for people. So how can you start breaking it down, think of your audience, and create stories that will appeal to them and make it feel manageable? So yeah, there's a bunch of other films on the platform around this particular topic, but the Other Ways of Living series is a great example of that.
Fantastic. Dan, you're producing creative every day in Ogilvy. What are some of the kind of more tangible, concrete examples of some of the things that you've seen either through Ogilvy or elsewhere that you think do this well?
It's a great one. Yeah, I mean, we did a piece of research last year. It was all about sustainable decision making for consumers, and the biggest correlation that we saw is that those that include what we might call a selfish benefit to doing so are far more successful than those that rely on distant planetary changes. And so those that include brands that include something that you're gonna, and it's often a product of what we call psychological distance. What's kind of happening now versus what's going to happen next year? How's it going to benefit you rather than somebody else? And it sounds horrible and shameful to talk about why it's going to be better for me rather than better for everyone else. But the fact is, we're kind of wired that way. It's interesting. We're talking about worldviews. The worldviews for me are like smells. Like you don't know you have one. And so if you're on the individualistic end of things, you think more about me and mine and protecting my family and my village before protecting a country and a nation and a planet. On the more the we end of things, then if you want to convince someone about making sustainable decision making on that me end, then you would go for things like talking about having breathable air, because that's literally around you right now. For someone who's more communitarian minded on that kind of we end, think about the planet, then you can talk about the dangers of flooding and distant countries. And so a lot of this is about making sure that brands come back to understanding how people are actually wired to know how to actually influence them, because all too often we unintentionally design for ourselves. We did a great piece of work with a company called BritBox as part of ITV, and we tested the marketing department's personality set, and we tested their audience's personality set. And the marketing department, who are young, funky people that live in London, city dwellers, have a very what we call future and present and future orientation. So they care about what's happening now and what's happening next. And so they're like, we've got to get Doctor Who and the latest episodes on there. You look at the audiences who are more rural based, slightly older, they care much more about, they have a past orientation. They naturally like to think about the past and revisit good memories and all that type of thing. So they just want more Only Fools and Horses and Are You Being Served and all those amazing shows. So by understanding who we really are, we stop accidentally designing for ourselves. There's a great piece on if you look at the personality breakdowns of those that people that work in sustainability, you tend to see over-indexing on extroversion, and so people tend to be more extroverted if they work in sustainability. And also you see an over-indexing in neuroticism, which sounds like a dirty bad word, but it just means you are more likely to be hyper aware about the negative things that can happen. So you're a bit more aware of what the dangers might be, and there's definitely upsides to that and downsides to that. The danger is we then try and talk to everybody else as if they have that worldview, and we need to learn, I think, how to kind of flip that worldview. So we need to double down on optimism, because we know that's not necessarily the makeup of the people that are detecting the problem. There's a difference between those that can diagnose and those that can design for a population. So it's about really, as I think Oliver laid out really nicely at the beginning, just it's about understanding who people really are, so brands can really make the effective change. Does that make sense?
It completely makes sense, and it's been a learning curve for me over the last 9 or 10 years since I've been in the environment sector, that lots and lots of people in the environment sector think that everybody else thinks the way that they think, and they communicate as if they were communicating to themselves. And obviously most of us are here because we think the world is coming to an end, and it's like really feels urgent and frightening for us. But to communicate that way is not particularly helpful. Ollie, you had some thoughts, didn't you, about sort of tone and language and terminology around some of this? How we
I did, and it's fascinating listening to the conversation, because I think not everything we were just talking about, but a lot of what we were talking about is how we connect with people working in creative industries and how we connect with consumers. And a huge part of my role is also how do we communicate with business leaders who have different functions, like a chief procurement officer, for example, and or how do we communicate with people who work in procurement? How do we work with the people who determine the supply chains of organizations, and how, where, and why people within an organization take circularity seriously? And it's exactly the same process of understanding who are those people, what motivates them, what are they looking for, what metrics are they evaluating their own personal success by, and how are they being evaluated by others, and therefore how do we need to show up in the world? So I think in a way, in a large way, it translates inside and outside of organizations. And one sort of experiment, I guess, we're doing at the moment is we took the 6 archetypes I just talked about, the different orientations to the world. And one of them, interestingly enough, Dan, really aligns with what you were talking about. It was what we call the self-interested idealist. It's the person who's very much interested in themselves and relatively idealistic in their outlook. And we took these 6 archetypes and we asked a question, an open-ended, open box question, asking people to talk about the ways they were potentially motivated or could be motivated to live more sustainably. It was an open question by design. And what we found is that people who were over indexing towards a care and a concern for the world and a care and a concern for sustainability, their language was really complex. And it was complex in the terminology people used. So you saw words like net zero, carbon neutrality, decarbonisation, that type of language, that type of discourse was there. But it was also complex because of the interconnections people made between these subject matters and these topic areas, that if I buy X, it has the ability to reduce carbon in Y, for example. That's sort of like causality dynamic. But the other thing that showed up, which was genuinely important if you're talking about like global communications, and I saw a question in the chat about this, is all of the ways that concepts and ideas relating to sustainability show up in the world where the word sustainability or circularity are not used. And people talk about obligation, they talk about care, they talk about responsibility, they talk about protecting, they talk about legacy, and they talk about very localized versions of these ideas. And for me, those ideas, they are the language of sustainability, but they're not the corporatized, somewhat scientifically oriented, regulatory compliance oriented discourse around sustainability, but they are a human capacity to care about ourselves and others today and in the future. And I think from a communication perspective, we could do really well to recognize more of that, listen to it, and use it in the way we're speaking. And I've done this sort of experiment before where I've been the kind of oddball in a kind of leadership immersion day, and the majority of the day is all about regulatory compliance and there's so many acronyms, it's almost humorous. And I come in and purposely just ask people, you know, what they're worried about or what they're hopeful for, and we start the conversation at that level, and all of a sudden people go, oh, this is the stuff I care about. We're like, yeah, this is the stuff you care about, just in a very different language from what you would normally use. And I think that linguistic reframing is really valuable.
Yeah, it's interesting, that idea about care, because we did some research recently for our sustainable food campaign that we run in London, Eat Like a Londoner, and found a really, really strong correlation between parents of young families and a concern about the environmental impact of diets, which we didn't see amongst other segments that we were able to kind of cut against for the research. It was really strong in that segment, and it is about that very sort of future focused, community caring kind of, well, it's not even community, it's about caring for you and yours. It's like being concerned about your children's future, which is a really interesting thing to talk about. But it does mean that planetary message it might work with them, it may not work with other people. And you end up talking about some of those more selfish drivers like personal health or cost or things like that. I'm just going to ask the whole panel to unmute for a second. I'm really keen to hear if you've seen any examples where people have got this either really, really right or really, really wrong. Is there anything, can you think of any time that you've seen people use the wrong language, the wrong approach with communicating about this stuff?
I can just jump in on a tiny thing, which I'm sure other people will agree with. We we keep saying ban the use of the non-charismatic expert, because you often see film or content or stories told from a very specific perspective, which is just not going to land with the right audience, right? And it comes back to your first question around audience. I think based on what you are trying to achieve and based on the message you are trying to get across and based on the change that you want to see or activate, who is the right person that should be speaking to that? What is the right story that should be told around that? What is the authentic link? Like there's so much of, you know, the chief sustainability officer of a brand telling us about their latest innovation, but that's not going to appeal to your mass consumer, right? You need to start thinking about ways to get across to your audience with the right experts, with the right influencers, with the right talent, with the right communications plans. And it's something that really irks me because I think we need to move away from that non-charismatic expert into something a little bit different. But that's to kick off the question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think oh, sorry, go on, Dan.
Go, Laura.
I think what Ollie was saying there about the, you know, Leaders' Day really resonates with me in the example I was trying to think of, because oftentimes where you see things go wrong is when they're all function and no emotion, or all technical. Again, when you bring in experts, you know, you're so compelled to try get things right, and especially in today's landscape where there's like greenwashing and you're trying to get green claims right and you're trying to just do the right thing and communicate, you know, at a basic level, you know, what you're doing as a business, but oftentimes that leads to, I guess, all the fun, all the joy, all the human sucked out of it. Or just, you know, you're adding to the wallpaper. And I think that's what happened. We launched a return scheme here in Ireland recently. My agency wasn't involved, but just in terms of the comms, it didn't work. And it ended up with people, you know, on the radio saying, you know, we're just being asked to do more stuff, you know, we're changing our recycling scheme, and this is just another big thing for me to do. And any of the emotional comms that I saw was just a little bit, you know, as you referenced there, Dan, like future, holier than thou, like didn't really lean into, you know, the edge or any humor or anything that would, you know, show the benefits of the how marketing and advertising can really sell ideas and come up with new worlds out of thin air. So I think you know, our head of social and digital said at a meeting recently, you know, you're competing against the highlights of the Olympics when you're communicating these days online or with a message trying to get people to do something. So you really need to think from an entertainment perspective first. So yeah, that example I have of Return, it was so functional. And again, like there is a need for that and for a clear call to action and clear comms, but you can't forget, like you are trying to demand people's attention and get them to do something that's completely out of their day-to-day habit. There needs to be something in there that injects a sense of the why and that collective effort and the impact of all of that at the same time.
Yeah, and that's something which I recognise from working in the public sector, is that kind of taking the sort of quite public sector view of things, and like, this is what we need to do in order to deliver, you know, the against local public services, etc., to actually let's just have some fun with it, and be a bit less hempy about the messaging as well. It's like sustainability, it's like sometimes it's just not glamorous and sexy enough. Dan, you were going to jump in. Come on.
Yeah, I love that point about being too hempy. I think that's there's a semiotics to sustainability communication, and all too often it is too kind, too gentle, too turning off, and we get a sense of, in an overloaded world, we have to filter out messages really, really quickly. So if it's not getting us, like everyone's saying, if it's not getting us quick enough, we're just going to dismiss it. We worked with can't say who, a UK fashion retailer on a closed recycling scheme, and you know, competitors can pay you money for bringing your clothes back, but they weren't going to do that. It was all a charitable piece, and so they relied on saying, come and give us your clothes to do the right thing. I won't try and give away the message, but it was all about nudging towards pleading for your better side to just do the right thing. But you know, as Einstein said, probably, you know, if you need to think 99% of the time about the problem and 1% of the time about the solution. Because if you really think about what the challenges are, and we interviewed a bunch of people and seen what the real barriers are, so people don't trust what's going to happen once it goes inside the bin. Everybody thinks that kind of a recycling bin and a landfill bin going to the same pot, and all that, all those rumors and stuff that are out there. So no one's trusting what's happening next. So we employed a principle known as the operational transparency, which is where people are more likely to believe something if you just show them a bit behind the curtain, behind the scenes, and you say, when it goes in here, it either gets sorted, it goes to X, goes to Y, goes to Z. And that was enough to, that was the best, we tested a bunch of conditions, a bunch of principles. That was the one that got the most, because it was solving the actual problem, not solving, you know, not expecting that people are like us and we'll just want to do the right thing. Because someone who's self-selected into a sustainability role in a brand is probably different to the audience that we're trying to get to. And encouraging people to walk in other people's shoes, I think, is the key bit.
Yeah, exactly. We really rattling through some stuff here. Before we go to some questions from the floor, I just wanted to ask a little bit about, come back to that question about circular economy and circularity. And I'm actually going to start with you, Dan, as you're in the business of selling stuff. There's obviously, you know, this paradigm of capitalism, which is about, you know, we make stuff, we buy stuff, that generates growth, it creates jobs, it creates a certain amount of wealth so that we can all buy some more stuff, so that more stuff needs to be made, and it goes on and on. There's, I mean, at ReLondon, we think that there's that apparent contradiction between wanting people and planet to thrive, and that model actually can be solved by some innovation in circular business models around sort of rental, repair, reuse, that kind of thing. How ready, in your experience, as fundamentally, forgive me, I know that you're much more than just this, but as fundamentally a salesperson, like how does that go down? Like, how do those innovative business models go down with people?
I think that businesses and consumers, it's a bit of a chicken or egg question about who's leading who. Do the businesses lead the citizens, or do the citizens lead the businesses? And it's actually a bit of both, obviously. So kind of as consumer attitudes evolve and change through some great work, then that puts pressure on businesses to have to respond. It's a great lever, and that comes up in every meeting. You know, as long as organizations have been customer centric, that's the best way of driving it. But sometimes there are many opportunities where brands can take a leadership position and walk people forward. So it's definitely a dance between the two, and anybody who tries to just focus on just one, or thinks that one is going to solve it, it's just not understanding the whole pie. So the brain believes in trade-offs, which is sometimes a positive, sometimes a negative. So it's the key bit to a proposal when it's about innovation to do with sustainability is the brain naturally thinks there's going to be a trade-off. The environmentally friendly bleach is not very good bleach. Else, why is it environmentally friendly? That's just naturally how people think. So when you do see kind of innovative business models, different materials that can be used, often, in fact, people find it quite exciting when they have something new and interesting to sell, to be honest. So we work with an organization that just had a new ingredient, which was incredibly way better for the environment, and it was a B2B product. And actually, for someone who's kind of worked in their role for the past kind of 7 or 8 years in that organization, finally having something new to sell is actually a really great marketing opportunity. So I think there is a lot of kind of hope and optimism that comes around that. The challenge is people don't always know how to sell it, which is about, again, people often think that kind of in a B2B environment, okay, we don't need to understand how the seller works, because there's so much procurement that actually any kind of influence or persuasion or framing isn't going to work. But absolutely, people in those processes are also human beings. And so it is as important to frame the information to them in the right way as it would be to a consumer. Often people think that kind of business to business is robotic selling, it's rational selling, when actually it's just you just succumb to a different set of biases along the way. So actually, I think a bit of reassurance to everyone, if you do just work solely in sustainability, it can often feel that things are incredibly hard. And but it's a bit like being in a restaurant where if the waiter is only rude to you, it's really personal. But if you then realize that the waiter is rude to every table, it's not as bad. And I would just say that every change is hard in an organization, whether it's a sustainability one or not. So it's not that just sustainability is a hard thing, just making change in organizations is a hard and complex task. And sometimes I think that's helpful for people to hear, so they don't just think it's just on them.
Can I answer Ali as well? Is that all right? Unless she's paused and she's disappeared and she's not online.
Oh, we're going to take
Let's
over,
say
Ali.
no, we're off. We're off. Ali's gone. I'll take that as a yes, Ali. Sorry. Sorry,
ahead,
Ali, is that all right? Are you back?
Yeah, sorry, I think I'm freezing, but yeah,
Okay.
go.
No worries. I was going to say a few things based on your sort of question/statement, which were really interesting. The first was the relationship between consumerism and capitalism, because that's a huge part of our work. And looking at, yes, consumerism and new business models and innovation can solve for what is purchased and the extent to which what is purchased is reused or redistributed or reshared. But if we are looking for opportunities, I think we should be looking at opportunities to combine that with conversations like this one, public and private partnerships, together with conversations about ownership models of businesses and structures of shareholdership, and also questions about taxation and global forms of taxation and where and how corporates can hide or not in terms of the way they distribute or don't their profits, then you're into a really rich territory of thinking about the role and remit of consumerism versus and with the transformation of capitalism. That was the first thought. The second one relates to what Dan was talking about, where often with circularity in particular, the enthusiasm is for thinking still in the paradigm of purchase, and how and why can we encourage and enable people to purchase more circular products. But circularity is a process of ownership and distribution of resources and redistribution of resources. So the points for communication are much more complicated in a beautiful and wonderful way. And as brands and as organizations, yes, you can have a conversation at the point of purchase or the point of return, but also what is your role, or what potentially is your role in someone's home in the act of reusing or not reusing that product? Where and how can you communicate with them on product, on pack, for example, like through loyalty? Like that's where it gets really, really sort of rich. And the final thing, which brings me back to almost what I was talking about at the beginning, is when we tried to understand what circularity and sustainability looks like around the world, we purposefully didn't ask people to show us. Instead, we asked them to show us and talk to us about things they were doing and things that were important to them. And one thing came up, a lady called Christina in Brazil was talking about this practice where she was making homemade soap. And she was doing it by going around her local community, and she was collecting disused oil, particularly cooking oils. And she would, in her kitchen, through quite a, I would say, like sort of somewhere between a science experiment and a cooking experiment, she would create these bars of soap. Brilliant circular practice through and through. And when she talks about it, it's because her mum used to do it. And she sees it as her way of keeping her mum's legacy going. And she doesn't want to lose that. She doesn't want to lose that, what she sees as this beautifully important, rich heritage. My point being that circularity is not new and novel. Calling it circularity is new and novel. So how do we find ways to encourage and enable people to recognize that and recognize it, that they do it already, if it is making use of what they have, redistributing what they have, caring about whether or not something is left somewhere that could cause harm to someone else. Like if humans didn't do that, and we hadn't been doing that for thousands and thousands of years, the world probably looked very different to what it does already. So acknowledging that and pulling it through and recognizing it, I think, is often the way to go.
Yeah, I really like that point about so circular products give you, and services give you so many more touch points with your customers. Like if you rent something to them, or you serve, the subscription models, for instance, or if you have a repair guarantee built in, then your customer's going to keep coming back, like checking in with you to do this and that and get a new version of whatever it is that they've rented, or get something repaired or get it refilled or something. That's a really lovely thing. We are running quite tight on time now. I'm going to jump to some questions, if that's okay, from the floor. First one specifically for you, Poppy. Someone's asked what you mentioned, the reframing of the marketing funnel earlier. Could you provide some examples of how clients have shifted from a conventional view to a different view, and some examples of what metrics you can report to boards as alternatives to those more traditional metrics?
Absolutely. Love that question. Just to jump off the final thing that Ollie said is super interesting about Christina from Brazil, because that's a story, that's emotional, that's a human connection, right? That's someone doing something that makes sense because of that emotional connection. And I think just to think about the stories that people really consume and love and take action on the Water Bear platform are stories like that. People living slightly alternatively, not using the word circular or circularity because it's a bit of a dead zone word. People just want to see things that they can relate to and they can get involved with and do themselves. So that's a really lovely example, of the kinds of stories I think resonate and push people to action. In terms of that question, thank you. We work with a number of different organizations. We work with Rolex, we work with Nikon, we work with Jack Wolfskin, Patagonia, Lush, some of the kind of core cult sustainable brands, I guess you could say. And every single campaign or partnership or production is completely different. So when we first started working with Jack Wolfskin, as an example, they're an outdoor apparel brand, a little bit like Patagonia. They came to us and said, we really care about rewilding, but we also really care about selling more jackets. And we were like, for us, it's really about talking about that rewilding story, because ultimately by caring about rewilding and putting your money where your mouth is and really showing that you are authentically engaged in that space, we can create something quite compelling. And that's what we did for them. We produced 3 films on rewilding. We've distributed and marketed those films across our platform and other platforms. And the metric around that was, it was as simple as planting trees, right? So that's a campaign there. So ultimately the call to action at the end of each of the films was join this tree planting campaign. Someone like Rolex is a little bit different because they deeply care about ocean conservation. And what I love about Rolex is they've now got impact metrics in their annual marketing report to shareholders, which is fantastic. And that's come about as a result of the work we've done with them. But it can really range, right? Because we have the back end of our platform, the Water Bear platform, we can see what people are doing. We can see at what point in a story people are triggered to sign a petition. We can use qualitative and quantitative surveys, so pre and post. So the work we're doing with Ellen MacArthur Foundation, as an example, is all about sentiment shift and behaviour change around the idea of reusing, repairing, whatever it might be. And that's as simple as an awareness and reach piece. So what did people think before they watched? What did people think after they watched? And what was the action they took? Another brand we're working with is about getting people out into nature. Others we've worked with have been about signatures on a petition to change legislation. So it can really depend. But I think the key for us is, how do you marry marketing metrics with impact metrics? Because ultimately by putting this emphasis on the impact metrics, you're ultimately going to start changing your business for good, which is what we're trying to achieve. I hope
presumably it can't start just with the marketing team developing new metrics. It has to come from organizational.
100%. Yeah. And you'll talk to amazing brand leaders and marketing leaders who are desperately trying to change from within, but they need that full buy-in from the team. And we often do these, and I'm sure Laura can relate. We kind of start with pilot campaigns or smaller campaigns to show that there is proof in doing something like this or investing in impact, and then you scale it. So yeah.
Okay. So another related question, can you provide an example of a business that incorporates reduced consumption into its business model and relies on that for it to succeed? I'm going to ask Laura first off if she has any thoughts on that one. That's quite a challenging one. I mean, apart from the ones that are circular from the outset, who are specific.
Yeah, I can't think of any examples.
Else, Dan or Ollie or Poppy, can you think of any that actually want to reduce? I mean, it feels like all the circular innovators that we work with at ReLondon start from that premise.
Yeah, and a lot of them, I would say, the more platform oriented businesses, you could make the argument that is what they're setting out to do. Like arguably, the core of how eBay started, for example,
exactly.
was it very much in that space. You could argue, I don't know the percentage of new versus secondhand products on the platform anymore, so I can't comment on whether or not it's still true, and or it's at the heart of some startup businesses that are particularly looking at using or reusing materials. Companies that, for example, take old discarded fishing lines and they use them to make glasses, and therefore the argument is that they're reducing consumption, because that is, if you take the view that it's not only a fashion item, it's an essential utility item. Everyone who needs glasses, whether or not they need 4 pairs or 1 pairs, you can argue. But let's say that people who need glasses need to buy glasses, and a company who makes them with material which is discarded and potentially threatening to the environment is reducing the consumption of virgin materials. And I think that's an important distinction between consumption of actual products versus distinction of new materials and resources. So that would be another one. In terms of big legacy companies, like companies who are genuinely categorically stating our role and our remit is to encourage people to consume/buy less, particularly of our own products. One that's interesting is Decathlon, the sports retailer. They are investing heavily in circular models. For example, their initiatives around tents and music festivals, for anyone in that world / has been in that world and seen the field after a music festival, tents became a lifelong or relatively lifelong purchase that people cared for, and they reused and they looked after, and they drained out in the sun after they'd been camping, and they reused it the next year to something people chipped in £10 between a group of 4 mates, and then they left it in a field. They're saying that's not okay, that's not right. You can buy a secondhand tent from us and or bring your tent back to us as part of a much longer strategy towards circular forms of retail. So they're on that journey. I'm not saying by any means they've achieved it. So there are examples of legacy businesses going in that direction. Unilever is probably the most contentious / famous one at the moment, for a company which was achieving plaudits and incredible positivity for the strength of its sustainability commitments and investments and progress, and as more recently having a different narrative regarding the viability and feasibility of shifting to that business model when you're still owned by shareholders. And that's where the legacy bit cuts in, because it's a very different scenario, obviously, to be a startup owned privately than you are beholden to the market. And that's what's happening with Unilever, as many people I'm sure would know on the call. So that wasn't an answer as such. It was more just to say different versions of the answer existing in different contexts.
Yeah. Dan, you turned your mic off. Makes me think that you're...
That's brewing. Yeah, I would just say, I know, conscious of time, but from a consumer point of view, status is a huge driver of behavior. And it's one of those things where, especially British people, we don't like to talk about it, but it's a huge driver of what we do. And probably the more likely you are to think it doesn't affect you, the more likely that it does. It affects people of all classes. And so I would give a shout out to companies like Patagonia, who make it a high status behavior to repair clothes, something that one could see as a low status behavior because it might suggest you can't afford new clothes. They've actually made it something that actually makes you, it's something that you can brag and talk about. And I think the more that we just really understand how to flip that and actually to make it the, not just the right thing morally, but the thing that's going to get you social benefits, people are going to give you a high five for it. And, it's those types of things that can make a big difference. So kind of appreciating the role of status and ego in a positive way, I think, can make a big difference.
Yeah, completely. That's a really good point. And I really like also this idea about the kind of the richness of resources that a circular approach can open you up to. I'm thinking about things like clothes swapping and sharing platforms, where they're like, why are you putting up with just a tiny little wardrobe of your own in your bedroom when you can have access to all of these clothes that belong to all of these people who live around you? And all of a sudden you can have like a plethora of resources available to you without actually having to buy and own them yourself. My CEO sometimes talks about the circular economy freeing people from the tyranny of ownership, which is a phrase that I quite enjoy. But it opens you up to the glamour and joy of more stuff without having to own that stuff and then throw it away when you're done with it. So, Laura, you've just taken your mic off as well. Do you have
what came to mind, speaking about some of the examples, is that, with the likes of Patagonia and REI and these like outdoor clothing companies who have actively gone out with an anti-consumption message, like don't buy this jacket or go outside on Black Friday instead. ironically, what's happened is after that time period that people have gone on to then buy from the company. So I think what's really interesting is that, you know, actually some of these things can be really powerful comms campaigns, but they need to be supported with that strong call to action and that piece for how do people actually engage with the right behaviors as a consequence of having their attention directed towards the, I guess, the values-based message or the impact-based message.
Yeah, precisely. Is that all of these things have knock-on effects, don't they? And
Yeah.
it's being able to work them through and understand what the impacts are ultimately going to be. Right, I'm going to close that bit of the webinar and just finish off by coming around to the panelists and say just one final question. You've got less than a minute each because we've only got 2 minutes left to go. If there was one thing that you could ask all communicators or marketers or people like me who run sort of social campaigns and environmental campaigns, what's the one thing that you would ask those communicators to do to make their campaigning or their communications more effective in this space? What would it be? Start with Poppy.
It comes back to the point I've kind of hammered home a lot. Sorry to re-hammer it home. It's audience. So try and think about the audience you're trying to reach, where you need to reach them, what kind of communication style you need to reach them, and who should be talking to them. It has to start there because ultimately it's your audience that needs to shift and the story needs to appeal to them.
Fantastic. Dan.
Oh, Poppy took it. No, it's it. But no, I agree, which is walk in the audience's shoes. I mean, sometimes there's some really simple hacks. People don't show a piece of communication to 10 very different people before they show it to hundreds of thousands. So even if you don't have that much money to do research, just show people it and get their visceral reactions, trust a gut if you don't have time to do qual and quant, and just have that thing of, will this actually work? Does this work in logic or does it work in reality? I think that is often a thing where if you hold the mirror up to yourself on that, and you'll kind of know your answer.
Yeah, perfect. Friends and family testing, my favorite thing. Laura.
Yeah, so I've gotten really obsessed with the work of John Alexander, who I'm sure you might know, but it's really around that word consumer, like try and erase it from, I mean, your worldview, right? Like, how can you challenge that within your worldview of treating people as consumers in your briefs or in your thinking? Because I guess what it does is it inherently presumes that the action needs to be a purchase, first of all, but also that it's very individualistic. And I think if we can start talking about citizenship and what that means actually in terms of not only collective interest, but that, you know, all of us are smarter than any of us, as John Alexander would say, to like get people involved and to see that bigger picture, I think is really important. And then also just day to day, don't forget the joy and why we're doing all of this, because we can get so sucked up in the CSRD and the acronyms and all of this stuff, but actually, you know, try to be human and ask those questions. Ollie was saying, like, what makes us worried? Why are we concerned? What do we want to live for? That's what keeps us going.
Fantastic. I love that. Joy. Beautiful. Ollie?
Joy and beauty, for sure. Thinking about communication as dialogue rather than communication as a sort of one-way street is another thing. Like, who are we talking with, and how can we listen to them? How can we learn from them as much as how can we shout at them would be another thought.
Yeah, perfect. Lovely way to finish. Thank you ever so much, everybody. Really loved that conversation. That was really enjoyable and whipped along. So maybe we will have to do more of these. We had such an overwhelming response to this one that obviously people are very interested in the ideas that we've been talking about today. So maybe we'll come back to it one day soon. Thanks again. Thanks everyone who joined. And that's it from us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ellie.